At 4 a.m. on any given morning, 20 autonomous monasteries across a remote peninsula begin identical ritual patterns that have continued for 971 years. Black-robed monks gather in candlelit churches. Psalms rise in ancient Byzantine chant. The governance structure functions exactly as medieval designers intended. Nothing appears extraordinary. Yet, this represents the world's most successful institutional design experiment, one that has outlasted empires, withstood wars, survived economic collapses, and maintained operational continuity through every major social transformation of the past millennium. Mount Athos operates under organizational principles established in 1054 that would be considered impossible by modern management theory. Complete gender exclusion, no private ownership, autonomous units coordinating without central authority, resource allocation based on spiritual rather than economic criteria. According to conventional wisdom, such a system should have collapsed within decades, not centuries. The community succeeded not despite these constraints, but because of them. Each limitation created feedback loops that reinforced institutional stability. The ban on women eliminated demographic pressure and inheritance disputes. The prohibition on private property prevented accumulation-based conflicts. The spiritual mission provided non-material motivation that proved more durable than economic incentives. This is not a story about religious devotion. It is a forensic examination of how design assumptions embedded within governance structures shaped every decision across a millennium. When institutions align purpose, demographics, resources, and authority around a single organizing principle, they can achieve what economists would consider impossible, permanent sustainability. How can an organization maintain operational integrity for nearly 1,000 years while every comparable institution has either adapted beyond recognition or disappeared entirely? The institutional framework of Mount Athos represents a deliberate rejection of conventional governance models, established after 1054 as a vital spiritual center within the Byzantine Empire. The community was designed around principles that inverted standard assumptions about organizational structure, resource distribution, and demographic composition. The easternmost peninsula of Chalcidice in northern Greece became known worldwide as Agion Oros, the Holy Mountain, serving as the guiding light of Orthodox Christianity precisely because its founders understood that conventional institutional design contained inherent vulnerabilities that guaranteed eventual failure. The primary artifact that enables forensic analysis of this institutional system is Emperor Constantine the Gladiator's 1046 decree, establishing the concept of avaton, literally meaning not to be walked on or inviolability. This decree was not merely a gender exclusion rule, but represented what the Holy Community described in its 2003 communication as rules that keep the ascetic use of cultural means and the wise preservation of a distinctive and fragile place. The avaton constituted a comprehensive principle expressing the nature of the Holy Mountain, and functioned as the foundational constraint that enabled all subsequent institutional stability. The decree's forensic importance lies in its systematic elimination of demographic variables that destabilize other institutions. By excluding women, the community eliminated marriage, inheritance, family succession disputes, and population growth pressures that create resource competition and governance conflicts. By requiring celibacy, it prevented the accumulation of generational wealth that typically leads to class stratification and internal power struggles. By mandating communal property ownership, it removed the economic competition that drives institutional faction formation and eventual fragmentation. This design philosophy reflects what can be termed organizational immortality through constraint. Unlike secular institutions that expand authority and resources to ensure survival, Mount Athos achieved permanence by deliberately limiting both scope and membership. The community consists of exactly 20 monasteries, a number that has remained constant for centuries as documented in the UNESCO evaluation. Each monastery maintains autonomous governance within its territory, coordinating only on peninsula-wide issues such as road building, vehicular access, management of pilgrims and visitors through the Holy Community Council. This structure eliminates the institutional expansion pressures that typically cause organizational failure over time. There are no shareholders demanding growth, No families requiring inheritance provisions, no citizens expecting expanded services, no territories requiring defense or administration. The community's only obligation is spiritual practice, a mission that requires neither growth nor territorial expansion, and which actually benefits from environmental stability rather than change. The community achieved environmental sustainability through what appears to be a counterintuitive approach: complete disregard for economic optimization. As documented in the UNESCO evaluation, the spiritual path followed here, laid out in centuries of profound philosophical thought, is characterized by restraint and the respectful use of natural resources. This approach leads directly to practices, methods, and an overall approach to the management of agriculture, forestry, and wild areas on the Athos Peninsula, which can be considered sustainable according to modern science. The exceptional condition of the Mediterranean forests on the peninsula results from harvesting decisions based on spiritual rather than economic criteria. Because monks have no families to provide for and no wealth to accumulate, they extract only what immediate survival requires. This creates a resource management system that modern environmentalists attempt to achieve through complex regulatory frameworks, but which emerges naturally from the demographic and economic constraints built into the institutional design. The governance structure operates on principles that contradict modern organizational theory yet prove remarkably effective in practice. The 20 monasteries function as autonomous units, each supervising the shelters, skete, smaller houses and cells within its grounds. Each monastery is therefore autonomous within its area, and only wider issues that concern the overall administration of Mount Athos fall under Holy Community jurisdiction. This creates a federal system without central authority, a structure that enables coordination without the bureaucratic overhead that typically emerges in complex organizations. The spiritual mission provides both organizational coherence and operational constraint. As one archimandrite explained, we can describe the Athos polity as the largest isolated living monastic community, serving the world by offering the strength of life, grace, spiritual wealth, and active prayer, reaching heavenwards in every way for the redemption of all mankind. This mission statement defines success in terms that require neither material accumulation nor territorial expansion, eliminating the growth pressures that force other institutions to adapt or collapse. The institutional design contained two latent vulnerabilities that would only become apparent under modern conditions: integration with external legal systems and management of cultural heritage under international frameworks. The original design assumed complete isolation from secular authority and minimal external contact. These assumptions proved accurate for nearly 9 centuries, enabling the community to develop governance mechanisms optimized for internal coordination rather than external interface management. However, by the late 20th century, these design assumptions no longer reflected operational reality. The community faced integration with Greek state authority, European Union legal frameworks, and international heritage preservation requirements that its medieval designers could never have anticipated. These external pressures would create the first systematic challenge to institutional autonomy in nearly a millennium, testing whether constraint-based governance could adapt to external compliance requirements without sacrificing the limitations that enabled its survival. By the late 20th century, Mount Athos faced institutional pressures that its medieval designers could not have anticipated. The community's success in maintaining traditional governance structures created the conditions for external intervention that threatened the very autonomy that enabled its millennium-long persistence. These latent conditions accumulated gradually, remaining invisible to internal observers until external legal frameworks suddenly made them operationally critical. The primary artifact that reveals these latent institutional vulnerabilities is the UNESCO World Heritage designation process, initiated by the Greek Ministry of Culture in the late 1980s. As documented in the Heritage Evaluation, the ministry decided to propose that Mount Athos be inscribed on the World Heritage List, both for its natural beauty and its cultural importance. This decision represented the first systematic attempt to impose external management frameworks on an institution that had operated independently since Byzantine times. The designation process contained a fundamental procedural flaw that would create lasting institutional tensions. According to the documentation, during the lengthy procedure that preceded it, the participation and final acceptance of the institutions of Mount Athos, the Holy Community and the double session, were not requested, negating its self-governing status that had been valid since the Byzantine era. This procedural oversight established external authority over internal governance decisions without obtaining consent from the governed, a violation of the basic autonomy principle that had enabled institutional survival. The UNESCO framework imposed management requirements fundamentally incompatible with traditional governance structures. The 1988 decision identified the site's outstanding universal value as stemming principally from the creation of a sacred site, the distinctive and timeless architecture of its buildings, harmoniously incorporated within an exceptional natural environment. However, this valuation framework required external validation of internal practices, creating ongoing compliance obligations that had never existed in the community's operational history. The designation created what can be termed institutional schizophrenia, simultaneous operation under two incompatible governance systems. Traditional monastic governance operated through consensus building among autonomous units, decision-making on spiritual rather than administrative timelines, and authority derived from religious rather than legal sources. UNESCO compliance required standardized reporting procedures, quantitative environmental monitoring, formal management planning, and accountability to external bureaucratic authorities operating on fiscal rather than liturgical calendars. This governance contradiction remained latent initially because UNESCO oversight operated through the Greek Ministry of Culture rather than direct intervention in monastic affairs. The community continued traditional practices while the external bureaucracy managed compliance requirements independently. However, this separation proved unsustainable when environmental degradation required direct intervention in internal operational decisions. The temporal mismatch between monastic and bureaucratic decision-making created a systematic interface problem. As documented in the analysis, the monks of Mount Athos live with the past, which for them forms a continuous part of their present and future, expanding time while engaging actively in the great mystery surpassing all things. This temporal perspective treats decades as brief intervals and centuries as operational planning horizons, frameworks that directly conflict with annual environmental assessments, 5-year management plans, and quarterly compliance reports required by international heritage frameworks. The community's millennium-long isolation created expertise in spiritual and agricultural matters but left it unprepared for interface with regulatory compliance systems. The monks possessed sophisticated knowledge of sustainable resource management practices developed through centuries of trial and refinement, but lacked familiarity with environmental impact assessments, heritage preservation protocols, and international legal compliance frameworks that external authorities now required. More fundamentally, the community's decision-making processes operated through consensus building among equals rather than hierarchical command structures that external authorities expected to interface with. Each monastery maintained autonomous authority within its territory, coordinating through the holy community only on peninsula-wide issues. This distributed authority structure had no equivalent of corporate executives or government officials who could make binding commitments on behalf of the entire community. The organizational vulnerability became acute when external authorities gained legal jurisdiction over decisions traditionally made through internal spiritual discernment. Heritage preservation requirements could override traditional building practices. Environmental protection mandates could restrict traditional agricultural and forestry activities. Visitor management protocols could limit traditional hospitality practices. Each external requirement created potential conflicts between legal compliance obligations and spiritual practice requirements. The community discovered that institutional autonomy, even when legally recognized, could not insulate it from broader economic and regulatory systems. As noted in the documentation, the Athos Peninsula is part of the Greek state and is unavoidably affected by the catastrophic financial and social developments in the rest of the country. Economic crisis in the external environment created resource constraints and administrative pressures that affected internal operations regardless of traditional self-sufficiency practices. The latent conditions also included demographic pressures that the original design never anticipated. Traditional monasticism assumed stable or declining membership, but the community experienced unexpected growth that created new operational challenges. More monks required more infrastructure, generated more waste, consumed more resources, and required more coordination, pressures that strained both traditional governance mechanisms and external compliance capabilities. Environmental degradation resulted not from traditional monastic practices, which had proven sustainable for centuries, but from the intersection of population growth, modern technology adoption, and increased external contact. Traditional waste management systems designed for medieval technology and stable populations proved inadequate for contemporary materials and expanding communities. Traditional transportation systems based on walking and minimal vehicular access became inadequate for modern pilgrimage volumes and supply requirements. The community faced what institutional theorists would recognize as a classic success trap: the achievement of its primary mission, spiritual practice, and environmental stewardship created secondary effects, recognition, and growth that threatened its operational foundations. International recognition of its achievements attracted increased attention, pilgrimage, scholarly interest, and regulatory oversight that strained the isolation and simplicity that enabled those achievements. These latent conditions created institutional fragility that traditional governance mechanisms could not address. The 20 autonomous monasteries could coordinate effectively on spiritual matters through shared tradition and informal consultation, but lacked structures for systematic environmental monitoring, formal compliance reporting, or coordinated response to external regulatory requirements. The community's strength, distributed autonomous authority, became a vulnerability when external authorities required centralized accountability and standardized responses. The accumulation of these latent pressures created conditions where minor external policy changes could trigger major internal governance crises. The community operated successfully under traditional assumptions about isolation, autonomy, and self-sufficiency, but these assumptions no longer matched the legal and regulatory environment in which it functioned. External authorities now claimed legitimate oversight over internal decisions based on heritage preservation, environmental protection, and international treaty obligations that the community had never accepted but could not ignore. The stage was set for institutional crisis not through internal failure but through the collision between successful traditional governance and incompatible external requirements. The community would soon face explicit demands for management changes that threatened to destroy the institutional constraints that had enabled its millennium-long survival, forcing a choice between external compliance and internal coherence that conventional organizational theory suggested could not be resolved without fundamental structural transformation. Beginning in 2006, the institutional tension between traditional autonomy and external compliance requirements crystallized into explicit crisis. The UNESCO World Heritage Committee issued demands that forced the community to choose between maintaining traditional governance structures and satisfying international regulatory requirements. This crisis represented the first systematic challenge to monastic autonomy since the fall of Constantinople, testing whether medieval institutional design could survive integration with contemporary bureaucratic systems. The critical artifact that triggered this institutional crisis was the UNESCO World Heritage Committee's formal declaration that the appropriate response to the site's major problems requires a comprehensive management program for its cultural and natural heritage, and indeed necessitates the active participation of the monastic community, acting through its governing bodies. This requirement represented a fundamental shift from passive compliance to active collaboration with external management frameworks, forcing internal governance restructuring that traditional autonomy had specifically been designed to prevent. The committee identified specific environmental degradation that required immediate intervention: pollution from liquid and solid waste, inadequately planned road building, the construction of buildings and infrastructure, forest fires. Increased energy consumption and the effects of climate change had intensified over recent decades and require an immediate response. These problems resulted not from traditional monastic practices, which had proven environmentally sustainable for centuries, but from increased external contact, modernization pressures, and population growth that traditional systems had never been designed to manage. The crisis represented what institutional analysts would recognize as design assumption failure, the divergence between original operational parameters and contemporary functional requirements. The community's institutional design assumed complete isolation, stable demographics, and minimal external interface. These assumptions had proven accurate for nearly 9 centuries, enabling the development of governance mechanisms optimized for spiritual coordination rather than regulatory compliance. However, by 2006, none of these foundational assumptions remained valid. The community operated within Greek state jurisdiction, European Union legal frameworks, and international heritage, obligations that created ongoing compliance requirements. Population growth had exceeded traditional resource management capabilities. External contact had increased beyond levels that traditional visitor management protocols could handle effectively. The UNESCO requirements created a decision point that institutional theory suggested could not be resolved without fundamental structural change. External compliance required systematic coordination among the 20 autonomous monasteries, standardized environmental monitoring procedures, formal management planning processes, and accountability to external authorities operating on administrative, rather than spiritual timelines. Traditional governance operated through consensus building among equals, decision-making through spiritual discernment, and authority derived from religious rather than legal sources. The community's initial response demonstrated what can be analyzed as institutional preservation instinct. As documented, some positive steps were taken in this respect, but very slowly. The delay reflected not obstinacy or incompetence, but systematic resistance to governance changes that threatened the institutional foundations that had enabled millennium-long survival. This resistance emerged from disagreement within the community, as well as from a predictable concern that the introduction of new and foreign concepts might threaten the preservation of its traditions. The community recognized intuitively what organizational theory would confirm. Accepting external management frameworks meant accepting external authority over internal decisions, creating the first step toward institutional capture that had destroyed every other medieval governance system. The resistance pattern revealed the community's operational understanding that compliance requirements were not merely administrative burdens but fundamental challenges to autonomous governance. Environmental monitoring required technical expertise that traditional spiritual formation did not provide. Management planning required bureaucratic coordination mechanisms that autonomous governance specifically avoided. External accountability required hierarchical authority structures that distributed decision-making deliberately prevented. The community faced what decision theorists would classify as a false choice between two apparently incompatible alternatives: maintain traditional autonomy and risk regulatory sanctions, or accept external management and sacrifice the governance constraints that enabled institutional survival. Conventional organizational analysis suggested that institutions facing such choices must either adapt structurally or face external suppression, outcomes that would terminate the community's unique institutional experiment regardless of which alternative was selected. The UNESCO pressure intensified through what can be characterized as administrative escalation, increasingly specific demands for compliance documentation that required internal governance modifications to produce. The committee demanded formal environmental monitoring protocols that traditional resource management did not generate. It required standardized heritage preservation plans that traditional building maintenance did not document. It insisted on systematic visitor management procedures that traditional hospitality practices did not formalize. Each compliance requirement created internal coordination challenges that autonomous governance had been designed to avoid. Environmental monitoring across 20 autonomous monasteries required data collection standards, reporting protocols, and quality assurance mechanisms that no single monastery possessed authority to implement. Heritage preservation planning required technical expertise, documentation standards, and long-term commitment mechanisms that traditional consensus building could not efficiently produce. The compliance demands also created temporal conflicts that traditional governance could not resolve through existing mechanisms. UNESCO operated on fiscal year reporting cycles, 5-year assessment periods, and annual compliance verification schedules that had no correspondence to liturgical calendars, spiritual formation timelines, or traditional seasonal rhythms that governed monastic decision-making processes. The community discovered that external authorities interpreted resistance as non-compliance, rather than institutional preservation, creating escalating pressure that threatened to trigger international sanctions or intervention measures. The very success of the community's environmental stewardship became evidence for external management necessity, when documentation standards could not demonstrate achievements that traditional practices had actually accomplished. The crisis deepened through what institutional analysts would recognize as feedback loop dysfunction. External pressure increased resistance, which increased external pressure, creating escalating conflict rather than resolution. The community's efforts to preserve traditional governance mechanisms appeared to external authorities as obstruction of legitimate environmental protection requirements. External authorities' efforts to implement protective measures appeared to the community as destruction of the institutional foundations that had enabled environmental achievements. This escalating conflict created operational uncertainty that traditional governance mechanisms could not manage effectively. Monks could not plan infrastructure projects without knowing which standards would apply. Resource allocation decisions faced potential override by external management requirements. Traditional practices faced restriction or modification based on compliance criteria that spiritual discernment had never considered. The institutional divergence reached crisis levels when external authorities began treating traditional governance as an obstacle to environmental protection, rather than the mechanism that had enabled environmental preservation for nearly a millennium. The community faced the prospect of external management replacement that would preserve the environmental outcomes while destroying the institutional processes that had created and maintained those outcomes. However, the community's response demonstrated institutional innovation rather than surrender to false choice constraints. The resistance period functioned not as obstinate delay, but as creative incubation, enabling the development of governance solutions that preserved internal autonomy while satisfying external compliance requirements through mechanisms that conventional, institutional theory had not anticipated. The breakthrough emerged through what can be characterized as governance physics. The discovery that institutional structures could be modified without abandoning foundational principles if the modifications enhanced rather than replaced traditional coordination mechanisms. As documented, the Holy Community's coordination role has been strengthened over the last few years, and it has become more widely accepted that cooperation and joint action is more effective in responding to common problems, without necessarily diminishing each monastery's autonomy. The community proved that institutional crisis could generate institutional innovation when resistance created space for creative adaptation rather than structural submission. The apparent contradiction between external compliance and internal autonomy would be resolved through governance mechanisms that satisfied both requirements simultaneously, demonstrating that medieval institutional design could evolve to meet contemporary challenges without sacrificing the constraints that enabled its persistence. The resolution emerged through what can be described as institutional physics. The community adapted external requirements to fit internal governance structures, rather than adapting internal structures to meet external requirements. This represented a fundamental inversion of typical organizational behavior under external pressure, demonstrating that successful institutions can maintain foundational principles while developing new operational capabilities when adaptation enhances rather than replaces traditional coordination mechanisms. The primary artifact that reveals this institutional innovation is the coordinated autonomy framework that emerged from the crisis period. As documented, the Holy Community's coordination role has been strengthened over the last few years, and it has become more widely accepted that cooperation and joint action is more effective in responding to common problems without necessarily diminishing each monastery's autonomy. This framework represented a governance innovation that satisfied external compliance requirements while preserving the autonomous structure that had enabled institutional survival for nearly a millennium. The breakthrough occurred when the community recognized that external compliance requirements could be reframed as internal opportunities rather than imposed obligations. Environmental stewardship aligned with traditional resource management values that monks had practiced for centuries. Heritage preservation reflected existing architectural maintenance traditions that each monastery already maintained. Visitor management extended traditional hospitality principles to contemporary scale requirements that growth had created. Each external mandate found correspondence in traditional practices, enabling compliance through enhanced traditional governance rather than governance replacement. This reframing process required what institutional theorists would recognize as institutional translation, the conversion of external regulatory language into internal operational concepts that preserve traditional authority structures while satisfying contemporary legal requirements. The community developed capacity to demonstrate compliance with UNESCO mandates through traditional governance mechanisms rather than adopting bureaucratic management structures that would undermine the autonomy that compliance was intended to protect. The coordinated autonomy framework operated through enhanced coordination mechanisms that preserved autonomous decision-making within each monastery while creating peninsula-wide coordination capacity for issues that required collective response. Environmental monitoring became a shared responsibility that each monastery contributed to according to its capabilities and resources, rather than a centralized function that required hierarchical oversight. Heritage preservation planning integrated individual monastery maintenance traditions into a coordinated preservation strategy that documented collective achievements without centralizing decision-making authority. The innovation involved recognizing that autonomous units could coordinate systematically without surrendering autonomy when coordination served, rather than replaced autonomous interests. Each monastery retained complete authority over internal spiritual and operational decisions while participating in peninsula-wide coordination for issues that affected all monasteries collectively. This created collaborative capacity without bureaucratic overhead, enabling external interface management without internal governance modification. The solution demonstrated that resistance adaptation cycles could generate institutional innovation when resistance created time and space for creative problem-solving rather than simply delaying inevitable structural change. The community's decade of very slow progress represented iterative institutional design that tested multiple approaches, refined successful mechanisms, and discarded unsuccessful experiments until a sustainable integration emerged. The community proved that traditional governance could interface effectively with contemporary regulatory requirements when interface mechanisms enhanced, rather than replaced traditional coordination capabilities. Environmental monitoring provided data useful for traditional resource management decisions. Heritage documentation preserved institutional knowledge that traditional oral transmission might otherwise lose. External coordination created communication channels that improved traditional consensus-building processes among the 20 autonomous monasteries. The adaptation process revealed that institutional innovation could strengthen rather than weaken traditional foundations when new capabilities served traditional purposes as well as external requirements. The enhanced coordination mechanisms developed for UNESCO compliance improved the community's capacity for traditional spiritual coordination. The documentation requirements developed for heritage preservation created institutional records that enhanced traditional knowledge transmission. The environmental monitoring developed for external compliance provided information useful for traditional stewardship decisions. However, the solution required ongoing management of inherent tensions between autonomous decision-making and coordinated compliance obligations. The community achieved institutional survival but not operational simplicity. The resolution created new requirements for continuous coordination that traditional isolation had specifically been designed to avoid. Monks now required training in environmental monitoring techniques, documentation standards, and external interface protocols that traditional spiritual formation had never included. The coordinated autonomy framework also required what can be characterized as institutional multilingualism, the ability to operate effectively in both traditional governance and contemporary compliance frameworks simultaneously. Monks needed to understand both spiritual discernment processes and environmental assessment protocols, both traditional consensus building and formal planning procedures, both liturgical calendars and fiscal year reporting cycles. The successful adaptation demonstrated that institutional constraints could be preserved through enhanced capability development rather than structural modification when new capabilities aligned with, rather than conflicted with traditional purposes. The community maintained the demographic, economic, and spiritual constraints that had enabled its survival while developing new operational capabilities that enabled external interface management without internal transformation. The governance physics revealed that institutional adaptation could follow principles similar to physical conservation laws. Total institutional energy remained constant while being redistributed among different functional requirements. The community's spiritual focus remained unchanged, while coordination energy previously devoted exclusively to internal matters was partially redirected to external interface management. No traditional governance energy was lost, but new coordination energy was generated through enhanced collaboration among autonomous units. The solution created what institutional analysts would recognize as emergent institutional capacity. New organizational capabilities that emerged from enhanced coordination among existing units rather than from structural reorganization or external resource addition. The 20 monasteries developed collective capacity for environmental management, heritage preservation, and external compliance, without any monastery sacrificing individual autonomy or spiritual focus. The adaptation mechanism proved that medieval institutional designs could evolve to meet contemporary challenges without abandoning foundational principles when evolution enhanced rather than replaced traditional coordination mechanisms. The community achieved external compliance while strengthening rather than weakening internal governance, demonstrating that institutional survival and institutional integrity could be simultaneously achieved through creative adaptation that preserved constraints while developing new capabilities. However, the successful adaptation generated new categories of ongoing institutional management requirements that traditional simplicity had avoided. The community now operated under what can be termed managed complexity. Multiple simultaneous governance systems serving different functions with different authority structures, decision-making processes, and temporal frameworks that required continuous coordination to prevent conflict among competing requirements. The institutional adaptation succeeded in preserving traditional governance while achieving external compliance, but created new operational complexity that revealed additional institutional vulnerabilities. While the community successfully preserved traditional autonomy while satisfying external requirements, this achievement required continuous management of tensions between autonomous decision-making and coordinated administration. The solution generated secondary challenges that tested the community's adaptive capacity under conditions that neither traditional governance nor external compliance frameworks had anticipated. The primary artifact that demonstrates this institutional complexity is the documentation showing how interaction and discussions over the last decade have brought all the institutions involved to a better understanding and acceptance of the principles guiding the management of a World Heritage Site by a male Orthodox monastic community. This better understanding required continuous negotiation rather than one-time policy establishment, creating ongoing administrative overhead that traditional governance had specifically been designed to avoid. The community now operated under what can be analyzed as managed complexity. Multiple simultaneous governance systems serving different functions, with different authority structures, decision-making processes, and temporal frameworks. Traditional governance continued to manage internal spiritual matters through consensus building among autonomous units. Coordinated governance handled peninsula-wide environmental issues through enhanced Holy Community authority. Interface governance managed external compliance requirements through specialized administrative protocols developed specifically for bureaucratic interaction. This institutional multiplication created coordination challenges that traditional simplicity had deliberately prevented. Monks required training in environmental monitoring techniques that traditional spiritual formation did not include. Administrative procedures required documentation standards that oral tradition had never needed. External reporting required quantitative measurements that traditional qualitative assessment could not provide. Each governance system imposed requirements that potentially conflicted with the others, creating ongoing tension management responsibilities. The complexity multiplication was compounded by demographic success that traditional design assumptions had not anticipated. As documented, after a millennium of existence, a monastic community like this one, especially one located in the European Union and on the fast-developing shores of the Mediterranean, might expect to weaken. The reverse is true. The number of monks is increasing, while the spiritual influence of the Holy Mountain can be felt across and even beyond the borders of the 20 or so countries where Orthodox communities can be found. This growth success created what institutional analysts would recognize as a success paradox. Achievement of the community's spiritual mission attracted increased membership that strained the operational foundations that enabled that achievement. More monks required more infrastructure, generated more waste, consumed more resources, and demanded more coordination than traditional systems had been designed to manage. The environmental problems that triggered external intervention resulted not from governance failure, but from governance success that exceeded design parameters. The demographic pressure created cascading effects throughout the institutional system. Traditional resource management based on stable populations became inadequate for growing communities. Traditional waste management, designed for medieval technology and materials, proved insufficient for contemporary volumes and compositions. Traditional infrastructure based on minimal external contact became overtaxed by modern pilgrimage numbers and supply requirements. Each demographic increase created exponential, rather than linear operational challenges. Additional monks required not only additional resources but additional coordination mechanisms, additional infrastructure, additional environmental monitoring, and additional compliance documentation. The community discovered that traditional governance scaled linearly, while operational requirements scaled exponentially, creating systematic strain on institutional mechanisms. The institutional stress was compounded by external economic vulnerability that traditional self-sufficiency could not prevent. As documented, the Athos Peninsula is part of the Greek state and is unavoidably affected by the catastrophic financial and social developments in the rest of the country. Economic crisis in the broader economy created resource constraints and administrative pressures that affected internal operations, regardless of traditional autonomy or self-sufficiency practices. This economic integration represented a fundamental shift in institutional context that original design assumptions had not contemplated. Traditional monastic economics assumed local resource independence based on agricultural production and minimal external dependency. Contemporary operations required modern infrastructure, energy systems, communication technologies, and administrative capabilities that created dependencies on external economic systems beyond community control. The external economic vulnerability created operational uncertainties that traditional governance mechanisms had no framework for addressing. Economic crisis could restrict access to materials, technologies, and services that contemporary operations required. Currency fluctuations could affect costs for essential supplies that traditional self-sufficiency could not provide. Regulatory changes driven by economic pressures could impose new compliance requirements that strained administrative capabilities. The community also discovered that institutional success created new categories of external pressure that traditional isolation had prevented. International recognition attracted scholarly attention, media coverage, pilgrimage tourism, and political interest that generated ongoing external interface requirements. Each form of attention created demands for information, access, consultation, and coordination that traditional practices had never anticipated. The success pressures created what can be characterized as visibility paradox. The achievement of traditional goals attracted external recognition that made continued achievement of those goals more difficult. Spiritual practice benefited from isolation and simplicity, but spiritual achievement generated recognition that undermined both isolation and simplicity through increased external interface requirements. The community found itself managing multiple categories of ongoing institutional tension: traditional autonomy versus coordinated compliance, spiritual timelines versus administrative deadlines, internal consensus versus external accountability, traditional practices versus technical requirements, local self-sufficiency versus economic integration, and spiritual mission versus visibility management. Each tension required continuous attention that traditional governance had never needed to provide. The stabilization process also revealed limitations in the coordinated autonomy framework when operational pressures exceeded coordination capabilities. Environmental monitoring required technical expertise that individual monasteries could not efficiently develop independently. Waste management required infrastructure investments that autonomous resource allocation could not optimize effectively. Visitor management required peninsula-wide coordination that traditional hospitality practices could not scale adequately. However, the community demonstrated adaptive capacity that enabled management of these complexities without abandoning foundational principles. The enhanced coordination mechanisms developed for external compliance proved useful for internal operational coordination under growth pressures. The environmental monitoring required for heritage preservation provided data useful for traditional resource management decisions. The formal documentation required for bureaucratic compliance created institutional records that enhanced traditional knowledge preservation. The institutional learning revealed that complexity management could strengthen rather than weaken traditional governance when new capabilities enhanced rather than replaced traditional practices. The community developed what can be termed enhanced traditionalism, maintaining foundational principles while developing new operational capabilities that served both traditional and contemporary requirements. The stabilization process demonstrated that successful institutional adaptation required not structural replacement, but capability enhancement that preserved foundational constraints while developing interface mechanisms for new operational environments. The community achieved temporary equilibrium, but recognized that ongoing adaptation would be required as external pressures continued to evolve in ways that traditional design assumptions could not anticipate. The community proved that institutional innovation could enable management of increasing complexity without sacrificing institutional integrity when innovation enhanced rather than replaced traditional coordination mechanisms. However, the solution created ongoing requirements for institutional management that traditional simplicity had avoided, raising questions about the long-term sustainability of managed complexity under continuing external pressure and demographic growth. The institutional adaptation succeeded in preserving traditional governance while achieving external compliance, but the complexity created by this success required systematic analysis to understand its long-term sustainability implications. The forensic examination of Mount Athos provides empirical evidence for institutional design principles that challenge conventional organizational theory and offer insights applicable beyond monastic communities. The primary artifact for institutional forensics is what can be characterized as institutional DNA, the self-replicating behavioral patterns that maintained organizational coherence across centuries without conscious management intervention. As documented in the community's own analysis, these principles coincide with those of communal Orthodox monasticism itself and include the unceasing devotion to practice and prayer, frugality in all aspects of daily life, and freedom from worldly shackles and diversions, familial, financial, and political, as well as from personal possessions, in a spirit of brotherhood and collegiality. These principles function as institutional genetic code that replicates automatically across generations through the formation process that each new member undergoes. Unlike corporate mission statements or governmental constitutions that require enforcement mechanisms, these principles operate through identity formation rather than external compliance. Each generation of monks internalizes these principles not as external rules imposed by authority, but as identity-defining characteristics that become self-reinforcing through daily practice. This institutional DNA creates what organizational theorists would recognize as self-maintaining coherence, systematic behavioral patterns that preserve organizational integrity without requiring formal management intervention. The principles generate their own enforcement through peer influence, spiritual motivation, and practical necessity rather than hierarchical oversight or regulatory compliance. This eliminates the administrative overhead that formal rule enforcement typically requires, enabling operational efficiency that bureaucratic organizations cannot achieve. The forensic analysis reveals the counterintuitive principle that institutional sustainability increases through strategic constraint rather than adaptive flexibility. By systematically eliminating variables that typically destabilize organizations, demographic growth pressure, resource accumulation competition, territorial expansion requirements, leadership succession conflicts, and external dependency vulnerabilities, the community created conditions for indefinite operational continuity that adaptive strategies could not match. This approach inverts standard organizational development theory, which assumes that survival requires building capacity to respond to changing environments. Mount Athos achieved survival through environmental independence rather than environmental adaptation, eliminating the change pressures that force other institutions to evolve beyond recognition or face obsolescence. The community designed institutional immunity to change rather than change management capability. The constraint-based approach enabled what can be termed operational immortality, institutional persistence that does not depend on continuous adaptation or external support. Traditional institutions fail because they must continuously adapt to changing conditions, eventually becoming different organizations than they originally were. Mount Athos avoided this adaptation requirement by designing operational independence from the environmental changes that force institutional evolution. The forensic evidence demonstrates that institutional constraint served sustainability rather than limitation when constraints aligned with organizational purpose. The spiritual mission required neither territorial expansion nor resource accumulation, enabling organizational design around stability rather than growth. Modern institutions typically fail because operational requirements diverge from stated purposes, creating mission drift that eventually transforms organizations beyond recognition. The Mount Athos model avoided mission drift through purpose-structure alignment that made operational requirements serve spiritual goals rather than competing with them. Environmental stewardship served spiritual practice. Resource constraint enhanced spiritual focus. Demographic limitation preserved community intimacy. Administrative simplicity supported spiritual priorities. Each limitation reinforced rather than hindered mission achievement, creating self-reinforcing sustainability. The institutional design principles revealed through forensic analysis include purpose clarity that generates operational constraints, demographic control that eliminates succession pressures, resource limitation that prevents accumulation conflicts, autonomous coordination that avoids bureaucratic overhead, and external interface management that preserves internal autonomy while satisfying external requirements. These principles suggest design approaches applicable beyond monastic communities for organizations seeking long-term sustainability. However, the forensic analysis also reveals significant limitations in the model's broader applicability. The constraint-based approach requires mission clarity that secular institutions rarely achieve due to multiple stakeholder demands and conflicting objectives. Demographic homogeneity conflicts with contemporary diversity values and legal requirements. Resource limitation contradicts growth-dependent economic systems that most institutions operate within. Autonomous coordination requires trust levels and shared values that competitive environments typically prevent. The external compliance crisis demonstrated that even successfully constrained institutions face adaptation requirements when foundational assumptions change. The community's resolution through enhanced coordination rather than structural transformation suggests that adaptive capacity can be built into constraint-based designs, but only through institutional innovation that conventional organizational theory does not anticipate or provide frameworks for achieving. The contemporary relevance of the Mount Athos model lies not in direct replication, but in design principle application. Organizations seeking sustainability might benefit from systematic identification and elimination of variables that generate institutional instability. Alignment of operational structure with organizational purpose, development of self-reinforcing behavioral patterns that maintain coherence without formal enforcement, and interface mechanisms that enable external interaction without internal transformation. The millennium-scale empirical evidence provided by Mount Athos suggests that alternative organizational models can achieve sustainability outcomes that conventional approaches cannot match, but only under specific conditions that limit broader applicability. The community succeeded by rejecting, rather than adapting to external change pressures, creating institutional immunity, rather than institutional flexibility. The forensic examination reveals that Mount Athos represents what institutional theorists would recognize as a perfect institutional experiment, a controlled environment where variables that typically confound organizational analysis were systematically eliminated, enabling pure observation of constraint-based governance effects over unprecedented temporal scales. The community provided nearly a millennium of empirical data, demonstrating that institutional design based on strategic limitation could achieve operational outcomes that adaptive management could not match. The analysis confirms that institutional mortality results not from external pressures or environmental changes, but from internal design flaws that create inevitable instability over extended time periods. Most institutions contain structural contradictions that generate increasing tension until organizational coherence collapses. Mount Athos eliminated these contradictions through systematic constraint that aligned all institutional elements around a single organizing principle. The forensic conclusion demonstrates that Mount Athos succeeded not because its inhabitants were uniquely dedicated or because religious motivation provided special organizational advantages, but because its institutional design made success inevitable through systematic elimination of failure variables. The community achieved what conventional organizational theory considers impossible: permanent sustainability without adaptation pressure, operational continuity without environmental dependency, and institutional coherence without bureaucratic management. The apparent contradiction between rigid constraint and institutional resilience resolves when constraint becomes the mechanism for resilience rather than limitation. Mount Athos achieved institutional immortality through strategic constraint that aligned operational requirements with organizational purpose, eliminated destabilizing variables, and created self-reinforcing sustainability that did not depend on external support or continuous adaptation. The system did not survive because humans were perfect practitioners of spiritual ideals, or because religious motivation overcame institutional challenges. It persisted because the constraints embedded within its governance structure eliminated the variables that typically cause institutional failure, making success a design outcome rather than a management achievement. When organizational structure aligns perfectly with purpose, and when environmental constraints serve mission advancement rather than hindrance, institutional sustainability becomes inevitable rather than improbable.